Braka, braka, braka. Welcome to the all-day marathon. August of 2024. So the world records that. Well, I don't promote no DMT, doing no drugs. But what they show you is what we war against, what we fight, what jumps in our lives in all aspects, and makes it a little bit more tougher. Hope y'all enjoy.
So classically, you get geometric patterns. That's the kind of first and most common thing that everybody gets. They're a little bit more elaborate than this. These are actually taken from some mescaline experiments in the 1920s, when they were first kind of identified, called entoptics, phenomena produced within the visual system, although we don't know exactly where they are produced. And they're usually a little bit more colourful, to say the least, and elaborate, and often people describe them in very verbose ways because they are quite extraordinary. So, for instance, this is some Shipibo artwork from the Amazon, a book called Yarn paintings made from threads, and it depicts the geometric patterns that are seen under the influence of ayahuasca. Although in this case, this is not just what the patterns that are seen, this is what the sound of the ayahuasca songs that the shaman sings look like, because often people have intense synesthetic experiences as well with DMT, so there's this kind of blending of the senses, and you may commonly see sounds, but that's probably one of the least astonishing things about the DMT experience. Often people describe these geometric patterns as having more than the usual three spatial dimensions. They seem to kind of fold in on themselves in seemingly impossible ways while still maintaining their geometrical integrity, in a way which leads the majority of people to, when asked to rate how many dimensions the geometric patterns had, tend to say they had more than three spatial dimensions, which, like, although that is a possibility according to current theories in physics, like M theory, like where we've got 11 dimensions of space-time, it isn't thought that you can actually perceive more than three spatial dimensions. And I've had some good discussions with like cosmologists and astrophysicists about, you know, the possibility of actually perceiving more than three spatial dimensions. And they say, well, no, it's not really possible, because, you know, they're kind of mathematical constructs, and they're kind of like dimensions are folded around themselves at the Planck length. You can't actually see them. Although that particular professor did change their position a little bit after having retired and gone to an ayahuasca retreat. He now thinks it's a worthwhile idea to explore, but that's a whole other story. Again, this is probably one of the least astonishing features of the DMT experience, but certainly some of the most commonest. And what we find probably is the most astonishing part of the DMT experience is the encounter with entities. You know, often sometimes of an insectoid nature, like giant praying mantises. These seem to pop up with alarming frequency. They're not actually that common, but I have encountered dozens, probably more, people who have a very specific entity encounter type, often, nearly always, naively to other people's experiences of a similar nature. Although now this meme, this dimethyltryptamine, is now kind of loose on the internet, so it's probably grown its own insectoid legs at this point. And that the experience is that people have the experience of having a giant praying mantis, often, you know, 10, 20 feet tall, looming over them, and kind of doing some kind of neurosurgery or neurological rearrangement on them, on their brain. They're kind of being operated on in their head, usually. Now, the praying mantis insectoid entities themselves are often described as usually neutral. Often they have no emotions, rarely benign, but never either considered evil either, but definitely kind of worrisome and troubling, just their very presence and their behavior. And sometimes people describe that they are being farmed for their emotions. Now, this is, okay, I can't say how many people have had this experience, probably less than 1% of all DMT users, but the fact that numerous people have had this experience is in and of itself quite curious. By far and away, probably the most common, or one of the most common DMT encounter experiences are with little people, what we might call elves or pixies or gnomes, dwarves, imps, whatever, you know, classic folkloric little people, although not your standard kind of cuddly little pixies in kids' fairy books. Terence McKenna, you already mentioned. Peter, the kind of the great psychedelic raconteur and bard, describe these things as self-transforming machine elves, because they don't really keep still. They're constantly shifting and morphing, and but they have the presence or appearance of an elf, of a little person. And of course, Terence said that with DMT, you get elves. Everybody does. Now, that was a little bit of an overstatement. Not everybody does get elves. I've had elves. I had elves on my first DMT experience. They were looming over me, kind of getting light and shoving it into my solar plexus, even though I didn't really have a body, because your body tends to disappear in DMT experiences. But the sense of where my solar plexus was or might be was being shoved full of light, and it put me in this kind of blissful, ecstatic state. And that was being conducted by what I could only describe as elves, although this was at a point in time before I'd come across any of the DMT folklore, if you like. So that was an interesting experience for me. And our survey research and that of others, as best we can, puts the prevalence of elves at somewhere between about 10 and 25% of people. So not quite everybody gets elves, but a lot of people get elves. So they're not entirely ubiquitous, but you know, they do pop up a lot. And just as a little side story, I would say you don't necessarily even have to take DMT to get elves. Occasionally they do pop up in other psychedelic experiences and non-psychedelic experiences as well. You know, the kind of fairy folklore of not just the British Isles, but worldwide, is suffused with encounters with little people. So presumably people have been having spontaneous encounter experiences with little people for a very long time.
And on TikTok, we showed you them little gnomes and little people running around. With fairy dust.
Although we can't be sure they're the same ones that turn up in DMT experiences. Nevertheless, and I'll tell you a little side story here. I was in Brazil organizing an academic conference on parapsychology, and we were invited to go during the conference every evening to various local groups who would take us on a journey into altered states of some kind, which was, you know, quite intense because we had a whole day of academic papers for about 5 days running, and then every evening indigenous community. The second night was drinking ayahuasca again with a Christian church, the Santa Daime, the cult meeting. That was also really good. We're getting quite exhausted. By the fourth day, we went to see these people, Gorani, who live in the jungles near where the conference was, and they invited us for a tobacco ceremony, which was like a great relief because we were getting quite deranged and exhausted by this point. However, something really peculiar happened in that everything went very, very strange that night, and we couldn't quite work out what had gone on, but we all had a kind of crazy misadventure, and in the morning we're all back at the conference for the final day trying to piece together what happened the previous night, like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, and all manner of extraordinary things are occurring. Like one of my ex-students, I should say, at that time had been dropped off at their hotel and found that their room was full of corpses, and was a little bit disturbed by that. So I went down to see the concierge to complain, and they said, look, I don't want to cause a fuss or anything, but I'm really tired and I want to go to sleep, and there's all these dead bodies in my room. Can you? So we have the extant accounts of DMT entity encounters from the get-go, the first kind of use of this pure chemical in the 1950s. And interestingly, in some of those accounts, people talk, unfortunately, all the original trip reports or experiences have been lost to history because the hospital where he worked had a fire, as did all his archives. But there is a few kind of comments published in one of his early papers about people's experiences, and in one of them, one of his patients, in fact, had an encounter with what she called dwarves, blue dwarves. So, encounters with little people are there before Terence McKenna let loose with his dimethyltryptamines and infected the minds of all potential DMT users with the idea that you're actually going to get elves. The elves were probably always there. So, nobody really knew much about DMT. It wasn't very popular in the 1960s and all the rest of it until this research by the name of Rick Strassman came along in the 1990s, and actually kind of was the man to get psychedelic research back on the agenda again after, the hiatus since the end of the 1960s. And he started working with DMT.
See all the eyes within the eyes looking at you?
Nobody knew what it was, really. And he's getting past the regulators and the ethics bodies. And he injected 60 volunteers with varying doses, including high doses of DMT, and was astonished to discover that the majority
people around here think they're doing stuff in secret.
More than half of them, he said, had encounters with entities. And he said, given that DMT is contained already within our bodies, in our brains, and that people have these encounters with extraordinary beings, like perhaps endogenous DMT, DMT in our bodies, could account for spontaneous occurrences of encounters with entities, such as during sleep paralysis, alien abduction experiences, so on and so forth, spiritual, mystical experiences, near-death experiences, and so on. And he's probably trying to explain too much with DMT, but it is curious that it is in our bodies naturally. And in the last few years, there wasn't much done on DMT since the time of Strassman in the 90s. But in the last 4 or 5, 6 years now, myself and colleagues at Imperial and elsewhere in the world have been reviving the research interest in DMT. My good colleague Chris Timmerman at Imperial was the first to report on his experiments. He had a pilot group and injected them with DMT in the lab, and 75% of them had encounters with entities. In my own research, which I may or may not talk more about, we did a kind of naturalistic study, go around to people's houses, and they would smoke their own DMT, and we had like 95% of them had encounter experiences with DMT. So DMT is very, very reliable at high doses, inducing encounter experiences. We also found that over 70% of them believe those encounters to be real. Okay. There's the other thing about DMT is that it has this sense of hyper-reality, what we call hyper-reality, that the DMT realm often feels more real than this world. Okay, so when people have these encounters, they believe them to be real as well. And the majority of our participants believe the entities to have their own extant sentience and ontological existence. So going back to this adage that
look at the Namos for the Dugan tribe. See? Once you know the signs and the symbols, it pretty much gets easy from there.
Interoceptive beings, perhaps we're just talking to our own.
Look at the CERN machine.
Perhaps they are really kind of elves and aliens and deities out there, or perhaps they're just a figment of our drug-addled brains, or archetypes. So I try and be agnostic. I'm not very good at it. But
I'm sorry, you call it the zodiac.
Let's open it up for some discussion.
That's what I mean by the CERN.
I'm going to close these slides as well.
Yeah, thanks for that presentation, David. It was awesome. I really enjoyed it, especially like the kind of the more academic framing of the ontological theories of these things. So if anyone has any questions, pop in the chat, and I'll call on you. You can unmute yourself, ask your question, David. I have one or two warm-up questions. So out of the 4 ontological theories that you listed of the entities, where do you currently land?
Yeah, well, like I say, I try to be agnostic, but I'm not very good at it. And my opinions vary, depending on the day and how recently I've engaged in a kind of psychedelic journey, probably. So, like, I don't have a fixed position. I think that's fair to say. And I think it's like different hats for different days. I think it's worthwhile, exploring the neurobiological reductionist explanations, which are kind of great. I've had debates with Robin over this, some publicly. I don't think our current neurobiological understanding really fits the data fully. Why would people seemingly naively and independently have encounters with beings which have very specific behaviors and appearances? Robin Carr-Harris, leading psychedelic researcher and neuroscientist, poses that, we're getting kind of thrown up a lot of random data in our kind of sensorium, in our kind of visual field and mental imagery, and through the kind of what he calls, it's like kind of type of pareidolia or apophenia. We tend to see what we're primed to see, and if you're showing random information or data, we're primed to see faces, right? Like we see faces in the plugs and in the clouds and in door handles, and we're primed to see faces. And he's saying, well, in this kind of random data in our visual field, we're primed to see faces, and then we apply kind of sentience to it, right? Because we're in this kind of extreme altered state. And that's kind of good as far as it goes. But it falls down on a few points. One is that, I've done some research with people who have what's called aphantasia. They have no visual mental imagery whatsoever. There's one guy who'd taken DMT 1,000 times, bless him. I don't know how he managed that. Probably because he does have aphantasia, has no mental imagery, and so he never sees anything. Okay, and now aphantasia is this condition. He only got given a name 10 years ago, right? Now I've done some research on it, and they've established that it seems to be genuine. Like, they do behavioral tasks on people, and they literally do not respond to stimuli in the same way people who can have mental imagery do, right? So that we know it's genuine, that they really have no visual mental imagery whatsoever. It's not like they can't access it, they just don't have it. And yet this guy still got entity encounters, as did another person with aphantasia who took DMT we did research with. So he was able to describe their characteristics, their, the nature of their being and appearance without ever seeing them. It's just like he had a sense of an encounter with an experience, with an entity, without actually seeing anything. So that calls into question the fact that was just driven by visual noise, right? And in kind of picking out these things from like in an apophenic way. And the other thing is that if it was just kind of random firing of the brain and just picking, falsely detecting a signal in the noise, then why is it so many people get encounters with giant praying mantises doing kind of surgical operations on them and farming them for their emotions, right? That is so specific as to defy a kind of respectable kind of reductionist explanation. The mimetic stuff is harder to get past. The idea that our experiences are always primed by our life experiences. But, and I've looked into this as well, but the idea of encounters with giant praying mantises isn't particularly out there. There was one account from Timothy Leary in the 70s in a really obscure journal. It started popping up in the alien abduction community in the 1990s. But it's not something that anybody particularly written about with DMT until relatively recently. And yet I've met people who didn't know anything about DMT, and on their first DMT or ayahuasca experience, they have these encounters with giant praying mantises. But we can't rule out that argument either. Nevertheless, the data, begs perhaps a different interpretation. And so I try and keep an open mind, and I'm open to the literalist explanations, the ontological explanations. I've had my own experiences which felt completely real at the time. And, I think there's also a danger of a kind of intellectual hubris from the kind of the global north or the west or the Euro-American intellectual position of nullifying these things as pure superstition and backwards superstitious religious thinking. But indigenous people the world over who have worked with psychedelics for thousands of years in many cases, believe these things to be real. And here we are, these kind of fantastically advanced Westerners. We've only known about psychedelics really for about 100 years, and there is a danger of a kind of intellectual hubris to just dismiss these encounters as mere neurobiology out of hand. So, but I think it deserves more exploration, and I'm not willing to put money on any one position. I'm sorry to be so slippery.
That's cool. I think having the capacity for ontological diversity is probably helps with navigating this phenomenon. The other question I had, Bob actually asked it in the chat. Bob Faulkner, who was here last week talking about unattached burdens. Bob, could you ask your question?
Hi, David. Yeah. Do you ever encounter people after, especially ayahuasca experiences, feel and believe that they have an entity within them that's really messing with them, causing them pretty serious problems? And how do you work with that?
Yeah, not often, I have to say, but it does happen. Yeah, absolutely. So I've been working on this challenging psychedelic experience project, and we surveyed people, only those people who'd had long-term psychological challenges from their psychedelic experiences, right, which maybe account for a small percentage of all psychedelic users. And then we looked at the kind of things that people were reporting. About half of them had some kind of ontological shock. I'm glad to say only about 2% said that they'd had some kind of possession experience. So it does happen. It doesn't happen often. I've witnessed it a few times as well. So a very small percentage, like overall, probably like less than 0.5%, probably even less than that, maybe like 0.1%. 1 in 1,000 maybe have possession-like experiences that they find long-term troubling, disturbing, difficult to deal with. But nevertheless, those experiences do occur, and we don't really have a good approach to dealing with that. I mean, this is probably one of the first times it's even been reported in the psychedelic research literature, and that only came out. Actually, it hasn't even been published yet. So, this is.
As you can see, people, when we're reading the scriptures, where they used to see these different types of things, now we know.
Like it's not something that people talk about in the psychedelic community, particularly, certainly not on an academic level. And yet, there could be numerous ways to deal with that. For some people, and it's different for different people. I think some people may benefit from moving away from that position ontologically altogether and just trying to ground themselves. Or it could be that they consult a shaman, or they go to a psychotherapist, or God help them, a psychiatrist. And so people will seek different treatments. And for some, they want a more kind of grounded, traditional Western approach, and for others, they want to have somebody to do effectively an exorcism on them, right? So but we're not in a position to kind of recommend any particular kind of treatment avenue for anybody around those issues, because this kind of is kind of relatively new altogether.
Any follow-up question, Bob?
Well, that's the work I do, is helping people get things like that out of them. So I probably see a unfair percentage of the cases.
Yeah, I'd be interested in that. Do you get a lot of people coming yourself from having had, plant medicine ceremonies and
Yeah, ayahuasca more than anything else, by far. And could you comment also on entities in 5-MeO-DMT as opposed to NN-DMT?
Yeah, very good. So that's certainly not as common. For those of you who don't know, DMT is what NN-DMT we usually call just DMT, and that's what's found in ayahuasca. But there's another kind as well called 5-MeO-DMT, which is found in some plants like Epena, Yopo, but also most commonly people know it from toad venom, snoring desert toad. And again, it's vaporized, it's really short, super intense experience, lasts 10 minutes, very similar in kind of intensity and time as a DMT experience. Although different to DMT experiences are usually absolutely jam-packed full of content, right? It's like experiencing the whole universe at high speed, condensed into 10 minutes, whereas 5-MeO-DMT experiences are more commonly the absence of content. People get white light, non-duality, bliss, peace, no mind kind of experiences generally, but not always. And occasionally people do have encounters and things like that, but they're far less common with 5-MeO-DMT than they are with DMT. I'd be interested if you get people coming with toad venom attachments.
A few, but not. You're right. Way less. One more question, if I can squeeze it in. Rick Strassman said that after all his work with DMT, it changed his whole model of spirituality from a Zen meditation kind of thing to a relational, interactive spirituality with other intelligent beings. Is that happening to you?
I mean, I think I've always been a bit like that, to be honest with you, personally. Yeah, and it is really interesting. And that's the kind of juxtaposition we see, between DMT and 5-MeO-DMT. It's all of the ideas around, the psychedelic mystical experience are, the measures we use even is about unity experiences, feeling at one with the universe, transcending time and space, feeling at one with yourself. And that's the kind of classic mystical experience that's measured. But DMT experiences are not like that. It's there is a self and another. It's relational. You get that with 5-MeO, but with DMT, it's like there's nearly always entities. It's nearly always relational. It is rarely unitive, right? There's a self and there's another. It's an I and a thou kind of experience, which is a very different kind. It's still mystical, I guess, but it's not a kind of classic unitive mystical experience. And so it kind of begs a different kind of cosmology and ontology in a way, which fits very much with a kind of shamanic perspective. You know, shamanism is relational. It's not transcendent. It's not about becoming one with the Godhead or whatever. It's very pragmatic. You know, they deal with these, what we call entities or spirits, they call whatever they call them, but it's relational, and they are like aspects of themselves. They exist within a community of these beings as much as they exist within a community of human beings in the material world, and they interact with them in the same kind of way, in a relational way. And the job of the shaman is an intermediary between the living, like humans, and the invisible beings, and they are in between us. They're go-between us. They are mediators between the worlds and within the worlds. And so, like, psychedelic experiences on the whole kind of drive that kind of relational experience, but very much so. And I think we're seeing a lot of that occurring, and I think that's what's kind of underpinning people changing their relationship to nature as well, which is a good thing. You know, people taking psychedelics and suddenly they are way more connected to the natural world, and they're taking more care of the world. They're changing their diet and their shopping habits and increasing the amount of gardening they do and shifting their careers to something that is more akin to living harmoniously and as part of nature. So I think so. It's relational on different levels, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Ultimately, whatever our ontological position is, right? There's a flip side as well, though, of course, is that people get terrified of possession, demonic forces, sorcery, hexes, attachments, etc., etc. That's the kind of the flip side of that kind of ontology. And just to add, you know, Amazonian ayahuasca use prior to Westerners turning up was all about sorcery. You know, a lot of it. Like research in the 70s by anthropologists, when they consulted ayahuasqueros about, you know, what their kind of job is, like the majority of their work, people would consult them for love magic, you know, how to make somebody fall in love with them. A lot of it was to do with either mostly removing the effects of sorcery or doing sorcery, like, you know, sending magic darts to people, and a little bit of it, the minority, was to do with healing. Okay, so and that's now kind of changed shape due to market forces of Westerners go and, you know, develop the KPIs on their new tech app, whatever it is. People aren't necessarily going out there for sorcery and love magic. So the market forces have changed what ayahuasca heroes do, but that whole world of sorcery and entities and all the rest of it is very much part of the ayahuasca cosmology. So no doubt that people turn up at your doorstep wanting entities removed.
Thank you, Bob. We have a lot of great questions. Sarah, I'll take you in next.
Hi. Just a quick question about whether you see human souls. You've talked a lot about, you know, other entities, praying mantis beings and little people, but no stories about whether people see loved ones who have passed or friends who have passed, either on DMT or 5-MeO DMT. So I'm curious about that.
Yeah, less so 5-MeO. Interestingly in our survey work and our interviews with DMT, we were trying to find correspondences with near-death experiences, actually, because there's a lot of research suggesting that actually a near-death experience is could be potentially be due to like a release of DMT in the brain when you have like a life-threatening incident. Good to see the ballerinas in the background there. And we looked at the kind of experiences people, and on paper they look very similar, but one thing you get in near-death experiences very commonly is encounters with deceased loved ones, right? Usually, sometimes, kind of angelic beings or something like that. And these don't tend to pop up quite as much with DMT, although they probably pop up more with ayahuasca. Like, so some of the classic early kind of explorers and their experiences and encounters with ayahuasca led to it being the first chemical when it was isolated from ayahuasca was actually from the ayahuasca vine. It was called harmine, not DMT. It's a different chemical, but it was called telepathy, right, in the 1920s when it was first isolated on account of the stories from ethnobotanists and explorers before the 1920s who had encountered ayahuasca. And there's a handful of stories, and they all relate to encounters with people who just died. Nearly always, there was this one guy. He saw a vision of his dead father, and that his sister was very sick. And this was in the kind of late 19th century. And then it took him 18 days to get out of the jungle, maybe the turn of the century, and he received a telegram 18 days later saying that his father had died whilst he was in the jungle. So that's one of the classic stories. There are other accounts of another explorer having an ayahuasca ceremony, and then the chief said, "Oh no, the chief from the next village has just died," in his ayahuasca experience, right? It's like, oh, he's died. So like those kind of encounters with deceased humans, yeah, do seem to pop up anecdotally, at least in ayahuasca experiences, less so than with DMT. We found about 1% of people in our DMT work had an encounter with a deceased human. So it does pop up, but not that much. You're more likely to get elves, probably more likely to get praying mantises or a giant octopus.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. John, you had a good question. If you can mute yourself.
My question was, have there been people, shamans, psychonauts, etc., who have developed levels of competence in traversing these other worlds and possibly interacting and skillfully responding to these entities? I'm curious if there's been accounts of the kind of capacities and skills experience traversers can develop. So when I'm imagining like a praying mantis possibly doing a surgery on me or someone, have there been people who can kind of like sidestep or say, no, thank you, not now, or maybe like come at me, do whatever you want?
I mean, yes. I mean, that is the whole work and process of indigenous shamanic peoples. You know, they work with these invisible beings, which you can perceive in these old states. They develop relationships with them, not just within their own work, but, you know, they can be hereditary relationships from their community across hundreds and maybe even thousands of years. I worked with this indigenous tribe from Mexico called the Baradica. They've probably been using peyote in that region, according to archaeological evidence, for over 5,500 years. They have a very ancient lineage, and they've been working with the same beings ceremonially for hundreds of years, thousands of years. And so they have a very kind of like maintained ritual structure, which, you know, requires that you do certain practices and make certain offerings, and that you keep out the entities you don't want, and you invite in the ones that you want to work with and negotiate with. It's kind of like metaphysical hygiene basics for kind of shamanic work. Something that in the West we're not really equipped to do or deal with, particularly outside of some religious structures. But, you know, in our kind of increasingly secular science kind of driven kind of worldview, there is no room for that kind of process and practice. But yeah, for sure, indigenous people and other religious practices around the world will ensure that they are communicating with and operating with the entities they want in the way they want. And you know, shamanism by itself is effectively it's a matter of coercion and negotiation with invisible beings, right? Kind of derivations of, you know, there's a theory within anthropology by Michael Winkelmann that, like, you know, your traditional nomadic hunter-gatherer tribes practice a kind of raw form of shamanism, and that is, as people became increasingly sedentary and politically integrated and agricultural, they started adopting more kind of mediumistic practices and even possession and what we call incorporation kind of practices. But traditionally, you know, shamans never really get possessed. They're there to kind of keep the spirits there right in front of them and negotiate with them, sometimes coerce them or control them into doing what they ask, as opposed to actually being kind of controlled or entered by the spirit. That seems to be a later kind of development as we became more sedentary and politically integrated and, you know, civilized and all the rest of it. So yeah, absolutely. Answer to your question.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Would you recommend any of these researchers or thinkers to look deeper into with regards to that question?
Well, that's the work of Michael Winkelmann, who's an anthropologist of shamanism. I mean, there's a lot out there. Maybe have a look at our book on, we edited an anthology called Talking with the Spirits, which is all about cross-cultural essays on mediumship and possession, and also like how it differs and overlaps with shamanism. It's called Talking with the Spirits.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, John. A good follow-up question would be Carl Smith.
Thanks, Peter. Hi, Dave. Great to see you. Yeah, my question. I know you've done a bit of research into dream recording, trip recording, and it came up last session with Bob as well around this idea of, obviously, you know, it's only the brave like Peter and ourselves that are talking about possession, and you know the potential impact that has on you know, getting mental health diagnoses of not very pleasant diagnoses, as you know, you're sort of seen in a negative sense. So do you think if trip recording becomes a thing, and I'd love to know what the latest science is on trip recording, will it open up the floodgates to accepting this ontological diversity that we all believe is there? And do you think, you know, some of the things that some people that are diagnosed with schizophrenia, maybe not having schizophrenia but actually having possession, if we can visually record it?
I see what you mean. Like, I see the kind of like hyper scanning, replaying back what's going on in a person's visual cortex in a kind of AI generated, kind of video format. That's super interesting. I hadn't thought about the implications of that. That could be very, very interesting. I think it could well shift like our perspectives and questions. I think the real problem is like, you know, the way science is done is like, it doesn't like going into these territories, right? And so it only asks the kinds of questions that allow it to get the kind of materialist answers they can handle, right? So, you know, nobody's out there going, oh, let's devise some research to see if entities are real. Nobody's really interested in that. As scientists, they value their careers and their reputations too much. So even though we may have this technology and it will possibly lead to those kind of like more open-minded perspectives. You know, scientists aren't queuing up to ask career-defining questions about the nature of these beings. That's part of the problem. It's not like people have been having these experiences for ages already. You know, it's just that it's seen as career suicide, and it's only in the last decade or two, with the psychedelic renaissance, that we're even allowed to talk about these experiences at all. Before that, you know, they're just consigned to the wastebasket of hallucination. You know, anything that isn't in your normal waking state of consciousness is either hallucination or a delusion, and we don't have to explain it or unpack it. It's just, that's what it is. Forget about it. You know, you should be thankful you're not hallucinating now, kind of thing, right? So, like, I think we are entering a new era where we're beginning to explore this territory in a bit more open-minded way, because the cork is out of the genie's bottle with the current kind of renaissance of interest in psychedelics. But, you know, we haven't yet published the data points that 2% of people having long-term negative consequences had possession experiences, right? So it's still early days, but I think in time, yeah, the kind of technology that's coming through,
we're still good.
the more kind of open-minded approach
what we're talking about over here in YouTube.
Could have us exploring
same DMT
these, these different experiences in a more kind of ontologically neutral way. Not even just ontologically neutral. You have to be asking the right kinds of questions as well, I think. And most scientists are too afraid to actually do that. I committed career suicide ages ago, so it doesn't really matter for me. But good question. Thanks, Carl.
Any follow-up question, Carl?
Yeah, I'd love to. I mean, you mentioned technology. I mean, Peter's named this series Entity Pill, but I'm thinking Entity Tech. You know, like what technologies, now that we've got things like the Halo Band due to come out any moment soon, which is lucid dreaming on demand, effectively. And I know you've done a lot of work, and there's a whole protocol that enables lucid dreaming. It's a lot of work. But if we have a technology that shortcuts it, means, you know, like most technology, you don't need to do the work. You just have lucid dreams, and everyone's having lucid dreams. Then it will be like, who's having the most bizarre, coolest lucid dreams? That will become the new currency. So I think that this is the moment where this opens up to, like you say, we weren't allowed to talk about this stuff. Then it'll be the only thing we talk about. That's probably where the technology will take us. But I guess my follow-up is, like, could you just talk a little bit about how dreams and trips could be recorded? Is it the visual cortex that's recorded and then analyzed with AI? I know I've seen, you know, images that you look at, and then the AI, the machine learning, is then reconstructing those images. But just tell us a little bit, if you know much more than I, about how the technology works.
Yeah, exactly that. It's a kind of like, usually the way it's done is like you train, you kind of get a very highly sensitive EEG, for instance. You can do it with fMRI, but you can also do it with EEG, particularly looking at the occipital lobe, which is the visual cortex, which, you know, processes visual phenomena. And usually, well, so far it's been done that you train people, well, you train the technology. So it's recording this high definition data of your neural activity in the cortex, and then you get it to record the output from your cortex whilst you're watching a set of random YouTube clips. So you're training it on kind of extant data, right? In much the same way as, you know, large language processors are kind of trained on internet data. So as you were training on your specific individual neural activity in the back of your head, and then it gets to a point where it can recreate to a fairly accurate degree what it is you're actually seeing. And it's not kind of 100%, but you'll get the kind of sense of, they're looking at a building with a door, and there's a person on the roof, and there's a sky, right? And it will kind of recreate that, but it'll be a bit like AI-esque, right? So it's fairly accurate to an extent. At least you can see what's going on. And then the idea is, and there's been this one study where they did it with dreaming. But this is kind of based on the premise that the experience of what we are seeing is mediated through the visual cortex, which may or may not be the case with DMT and DMT entities, especially given that people who have no visual mental imagery still have DMT entity encounters, right? So it's yet to be demonstrated. No one's done it with the psychedelic experiences yet, but the principle is that you train the algorithms on your particular neural activity for a particular set of visual data, and then it can recreate whatever's going on in your occipital lobe. So I'd love to see what comes out of your head, Carl.
Don't we all?
Maybe not. It's too much.
Thank you, Carl. Okay, let's go with Jonathan next. Jonathan, you had a skeptical question.
Well, I had two questions, but I can. I think for me the most important question is about these insectoid alien brain surgery creatures. If we go with the contextualist or mimetic idea of them, maybe you shouldn't talk about them, basically, because then you kind of plant the seed in people. And I'm curious on your take on that whole thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I usually preface my talks by saying, I've now ruined it. I mean, there's one other encounter which I've had, which I found, which kind of really blew my mind, put me off taking DMT. In fact, it scared the life out of me. And I then found kind of trip reports scattered around in various publications and online of other people having the same encounter experience. And so then I wrote about that. But then, of course, I've also then ruined the possibility of ever collecting more data on that in a way in which it hasn't been confounded by possible means.
Like a friend.
But that's the choice you have to take, isn't it?
So,
well,
I got to give it in, close
talk
this,
about
I'm
this
closing this. Ishe Shalom,
in an
Braka.
educational way.
Stay with the Holy Spirit.
Total
Move
scientist
forces with the mind of the matter of the
I'm not going to talk
divine
about
mind.
that
Who
because
knows the mind of
I'll
the
ruin
Lord?
the possibility of later change collection.
Chapter
But no,
2.
there are other beings out there, that people have encounters with, which we could easily.
What's
point
good,
to.
YouTube?
There's a book coming out pretty soon.
Hope you enjoyed. I was just talking and closing out with Facebook. Yeah, we multitasking around here doing 3 different things as if I won't go to crazy rabbit SHIT. Just being honest. So, but it worked out though. I was able to, Braka Andy, I was able to multitask this time and everything went perfectly. And now we're going to close here. Hope you enjoyed and hope you learned Beethoven keys, Braka. Because that's what it's all about. And breathing. I'm not the teacher. Brother BC gets no credit for nothing. Only credit that you could give Brother BC is he had sense enough, Lord, to turn back and come back home to the great mother and father, which he would call saving his soul. Other than that, everything else is the Holy Spirit. Ruach Yaso Asha. Some Paleo Hebrew say Ruach HaKodesh. Y'all stay eternally Braka. Some understand to say blessed.